Lupe Jolie, aka La Lupe, aka La Yiyigi, aka the Queen of Latin Soul. Like all these historical figures in the videos, I cannot touch on every single detail of a person's life, but I will do my best. So if I neglect to say something of importance, I'm sorry. So, La Lupe, she was born in 1939 in San Pedrito, which is within the province of Santiago, Cuba. She was, as her sister put it, and I quote, just another poor black girl. But culture and the culture of Ocha and Palo was something that surrounded her from the time she was born within Santiago de Cuba. By the late 50s, early 60s, so born 1939, by the late 50s, early 60s, La Lupe was singing at small clubs and she gained traction. She gained a measurable amount of fame, especially in more liberal clubs. When I say more liberal clubs, places where homosexuality was more accepted. There was a kind of cultural revolution that was going on in Cuba, aside from the literal revolution of 1959, but we'll get there. But she was gaining a lot of fame in these more liberal clubs. It was her antics on stage with the bands that she joined that earned her notoriety in Cuba. She would yell, she would shout, she would moan with these sexual undertones. She would yell out, "Ay, yi, yi, yi," and these nonsensical phrases that she would just make up on the spot. She would hit herself. She would hit her bandmates. She would take off her shoes. She would rip off her clothes layer by layer. When I say rip off her clothes, I don't mean like a stripper. I mean, maybe she's wearing a coat and she would just frantically like try to rip it off herself and just take off these layers of clothes, but not like in a stripper way. What else? And she would dance on stage with this frenetic energy and all of this. Everything I just said, in the middle of her performance, she'd be screaming and yelling and hitting herself in the middle of her performance, and people ate it up. Everyone except the new regime. So remember that Cuba changed in 1959 from one dictator to another, from the rule of Batista to Fidel Castro. And in the 50s, Havana, Cuba was the place to be. And the American wealthy company owners and even celebrities like Frank Sinatra would party it up in Havana to the sounds of Boogaloo. And when I say Boogaloo, I mean old 1950s Boogaloo, not electric Boogaloo and whatever else happens to exist. Boogaloo, Boogaloo. The precursor to salsa and what we know today, Boogaloo. The Havana nightlife was the greatest in the world for rich Americans and for the few elites of Cuban society. After 1959, Fidel Castro changed everything, including what was deemed as appropriate entertainment. And 3 years into Castro's new regime, because the revolution, the Cuban Revolution took place in 1959, and power went from Batista to Castro in 1959. In 1962, La Lupe was exiled from Cuba for not fitting into the new Cuba's more conservative views, into Fidel Castro's new Cuba. What she did was not considered as appropriate entertainment. It was too wild, it wasn't conservative enough, and it just didn't fit into Castro's idealistic society. So La Lupe ends up moving to, or exiled, and moves to New York City. I don't know if it was the Bronx, I don't know if it was Spanish Harlem, but those are two areas that were full of Hispanics. Most likely, I'm leaning more towards Spanish Harlem. Either way, it was full of Puerto Ricans. And it's just a whole topic unto itself, how the Cubans and Puerto Ricans interacting with each other, specifically in New York, which used to be the mecca of Ocha. What grew as a result of a bunch of Cubans intermingling with Puerto Ricans really has created something different. It's a very interesting topic, but I digress. So I don't know if La Lupe goes in 1962 to the Bronx or to Spanish Harlem, but we know it happened in 1962 with little money in her pocket, speaking zero English, and a dream. That's all she had. Ironically enough, she actually ended up quite mastering the English language. Details are funny, or are fuzzy, but from my understanding, let me just get my notes. Details are fuzzy, but from my understanding, La Lupe attended a Mongo Santa Maria orchestra concert and began to sing along and do all of her antics as an audience member, and people loved it. So Mongo, who, if you don't know, he's a famous Cuban boogaloo and Cuban jazz band leader and composer. He did a song called Watermelon Man. It's probably his most famous song. He said, let's put a mic on this woman. Let's include her in the band. And between the years of 1963 and 1965, she was with the Mongo Santa Maria orchestra. She arrived in 62. And by 63, a year into her time of being in New York City, she already was a part of a band. It was not her first time being in a band. The actual names of the bands that she was involved with in Cuba, those are just things that I glossed over simply because it's a lot of information. But we know that she was constantly in bands. Continuing on, she was with the Mongo Santa Maria band between 1963 and 1965. In 1965, a man by the name of Ernest Puente Jr., aka Tito Puente, who a Puerto Rican, who was already a respected and established music arranger, composer, and band leader, saw La Lupe perform at Mongo Santa Maria's band, a concert of sorts. And when he heard her voice and he saw how captivating that she was, he wanted her for his own band. In the end, in 1965, La Lupe was pregnant at the time and wanted to tour with Mongo, specifically in Puerto Rico, to take a plane. But Mongo told her no because she was pregnant. It wouldn't be good for her to take a plane to Puerto Rico because she was pregnant. So she left the Mongo Santa Maria band and she went to be in Tito Puente's band, who Tito Puente came and scooped her up. From 1962, 3 years later, after arriving, she was singing lead for arguably the most famous Latin band in the world at the time, the Tito Puente Orchestra, and ended up signing a major record deal. 1965 began, and at this point now, she's wearing tons of big, bold jewelry, diamond rings on every finger, full-length fur coats, having multiple cars in her driveway. An interesting little nugget, she actually lived in the rich Jewish area of Fort Lee, New Jersey. So it's actually New Jersey where she made her home during her success, or after and during her success. Now let's get into the part that everybody's waiting for. La Lupe was crowned Ochun. Exactly what her path is, I don't know. I never got that information. Her father was Chango. Now, La Lupe, so she got it big. She made it big in 65. La Lupe got initiated into Ocha in 1968 or 1969, and I will give the reason why I cannot be 100% sure. She was initiated by Carmen Prieto Changodina, and the Obaoriate was Victor Garcia, aka Vicky Ochainle, who was the Obaoriate. Whether Victor Garcia was the Ojubona, I do not know. But he was, at that point in time, in the US, he was one of very few Obaoriates working in the United States. We're talking about 1969. The first Ocha in this country, in the United States, was 1964. And Victor Garcia was one of two Obaoriates to conduct that that Ocha. It was Julia. Ay, coño. It was a Puerto Rican, and that has to do with that's a whole video unto itself. But whether Victor Garcia was the Oba Oriate and the Yubona, I don't know. One source, an older gentleman, a Dominican actually, who was made in the early 80s or the 70s, I'm not sure. He told me that it was actually a woman by the name of Otilia Mima Ochuntoki Ejila was somehow involved. But this was not confirmed by anyone. But maybe Carmen Prieto Changodina was the godfather, and the Yubona was this Otilia, and the Obaurete was Vicky Ochainle. I cannot confirm that. The only thing that I know for sure is that her padrino is Carmen Prieto Changodina, and the Obauriate was Vicky Ochainle, who was a child of Owatala, as his name indicates. So, Victor Garcia Ochainle deserves his own video because, like I said, he's one of two working Obauriates, the first two Obauriates in U.S. history ever. That's a big deal. Continuing on, the reason why I do not know whether La Lupe was made in 1968 or 1969 is because in 1969, the album cover and the album release for La Lupe es la Reina of that album, as you can see on the cover, because I'm going to have it here, she is a Yawo. The album itself released in 1969, but the entertainment industry, whether she, it takes a long time to make an album and all the stuff that's involved. So potentially she was made in 68, but the actual album did not release until 1969. No different than if a movie comes out today, it was filmed from beginning to end in production and all that for the past 2 years. So the album came out in 1969, but maybe she was between years. So she was made either 1968 or 1969. And on the album cover, she is a Yawo. Something that caused an uproar within the Ocha community at the time, and still would cause an uproar today. Why? Because Yawos are not allowed to be photographed or filmed. For what reason exactly, I've never heard, in my opinion, any justifiable reason for this, but I do understand it as a long-standing taboo and tradition. Interestingly enough, a side note, Lydia Cabrera was actually allowed to photograph a Yawo in 1952. And now that photo is a wonderful testament to Cuban Ocha. So, and now we know what La Lupe looked like as a Yawo. And looking back at it now, from a historical standpoint, I think it's a beautiful thing. I think it's a beautiful thing to see La Lupe as a Yawo. As a matter of fact, how incredible would it have been to be able to have seen, if there was footage of someone getting initiated in the 1930s and we see everything in black and white and then eventually could get colorized and whatnot. That would be amazing. But I'm thinking from a historical point of view, all that would have been completely seen as inappropriate. But I digress. So, between 1965 and 1968, between the time she signed to Tico Records, I forgot to mention that, she got signed to Tico Records, a major record deal, and with Tito Puente, and 1968. Between 1965 and 1968, La Lupe saw major success with her collaboration albums she did with Tito Puente. Everything was going great for La Lupe. Everything was going great for Tito Puente. And Tito Puente, at this point, his career from the 50s, his career just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Although Tito Puente saw his highest success in the 70s. I digress again. I just go on and on and on. Everything was great for La Lupe. Everything was great for Tito Puente. And the two had built strong careers as a duo until as Izzy Sanabria, who was an MC and a journalist, who was there for the entire 60s and 70s Fania All-Stars craze, as he puts it, Quote, La Lupe got so much publicity, no Latino entertainer at that time had gotten that kind of exposure. He continues, she was a singer with the Tito Puente Orchestra. That's the way Tito liked to have things. He had a singer. But it came a point where the people were coming to see La Lupe backed by the Tito Puente Orchestra, and that did not sit well with Tito. He continues to say, all I know, quote, all I know is that it got to the point where they couldn't work together. She was too much of a star. End quote. So there was definitely a divisiveness between Tito Puente and La Lupe once Tito Puente began working with one woman that we all know and love by the name of Celia Cruz. And that's where division became, aside from her own fame. By 1973, now we're gonna speed things up. Fast forward to 1973. We know she got made she found her fame in 1965. She got crowned in 1968 or 9. Top of her career. By 1973, La Lupe's music career was at its lowest point. By 1974, Tico Records was bought out by Fania Records. Fania Records had signed Celia Cruz and made her Fania's main female act, even though La Lupe had been with the record company and had been the biggest star and the main attraction. So this, as you can imagine, angered and embittered La Lupe toward the music industry, toward Tito Puente, possibly toward Celia Cruz. Apparently there was no beef between them, but I could see how there could be beef, or at least if not an actual beef of interacting with Celia Cruz and La Lupe, any actual, there was, I would imagine, an unspoken rivalry. So, because Tito Puente, his ride or die was La Lupe. She got too famous for him, and then his new ride or die became Celia Cruz, where I need to get back on top. So now I'm gonna switch things up and make sure for this next woman that I work with that I don't want to say that she stays put, but I can't have anybody more famous than me. I can't have anybody coming to see Celia Cruz. I need people coming to see Tito Puente backed by Celia Cruz. And a lot of this decent amount of what I'm saying, at least this end part, is speculation. So by 1974, the craze that swept New York City and the world with the Fania All-Stars, with Tito Puente, with Hector Lavoe, Willie Colon, Ray Barretto, Yomo Toro, Ismael Rivera, Larry Harlow, Cheo Feliciano, Johnny Pacheco, Ruben Blades, and these so many huge legends. Plus a single female in the entire Fania All-Star roster, the entire company, the entire record label. One female, Celia Cruz. So there was no room for two women to be in the same group. La Lupe got the boot and was replaced with Celia Cruz. In La Lupe's albums in the 70s specifically, go back and listen to 1971, 2, 3, where La Lupe refused to move with the times and beat Tito Puente and Fania All-Stars at their own game. La Lupe did not make salsa, which was the biggest craze in the 1970s. La Lupe, she made boleros. Her most famous songs are where she sings about heartbreak and tragedy. But the Puerto Ricans and the Latin music scene of New York City in the 70s were not the same of the 60s revolution. They're not the same. So you can hear La Lupe singing covers in her 70s albums. You can hear her singing covers of American pop songs in English or American pop songs in Spanish, because she has both. She has songs in English. Meanwhile, it was salsa that was the next generation. That's what they wanted to hear. So La Lupe, she went solo, but at the advent of salsa and her inability to compete with the new craze new craze called salsa, she went on. She went under. Her career went under. Going back to her religious life. As far as her religious life, there are many rumors and fuzzy areas here. If you look at her performances, you can see her getting touched with something, or more so someone, when she dances to the drums, even in the middle of her 1985 benefit concert with Tito Puente, as we will speak about, even in her Central Park performance that you can see in the documentary. She looks like she's getting touched with someone. Though, her assistant insists that it was all part of the show. Some say that La Lupe became fanatical, doing everything that her padrino, Chango Dina, told her to, getting frequent readings. Some even saying that before a show she would get a reading to ensure that everything would be all right. That's speculation. What is confirmed is that one time, while in the middle of a dramatic performance in a brief and unsuccessful stint on Broadway, La Lupe performed on Broadway as well, in the 70s, at the decline of her career, she thought, maybe let me try acting. La Lupe brought an ota of her chango on stage and hidden on her person, somewhere on her person, while she was performing. This ota, the stone of chango, fell onto the stage in the middle of her performance on Broadway and interrupted the entire show as she quickly picked it up off of the floor. And I guess continued on with the show. I don't know. It's said that she referred to her padrino, Chango Dina, as, quote, maldito Chango Dina, which is like the cursed. Maldito, maldición means curse, but basically this is like that goddamn Chango Dina. And we know that there was some kind of division between her and her padrino. Perhaps La Lupe was being taken advantage of for her money and fame. That's speculation. Let me see. Yeah, perhaps La Lupe was being taken advantage of for her money and for her fame. Remember that she was initiated to Ochun in 1968-1969, which was still at the height of her fame, and everybody knew who La Lupe was. This is equivalent. If I had to put it in perspective, this is like being the padrino of J-Lo, of Jennifer Lopez, in the middle of the 2000s. Because, you know, J-Lo, she was at the peak of her career in the middle of the 2000s, and her acting, I mean, she's still enormous. But she, you know, her films made in Manhattan, and her albums going #1, her movies going #1, she was at the top. That's like being the padrino of someone like that. So it's not completely implausible to think that maybe there was some shisty stuff going on with her padrino, to call him that goddamn Chango Dina, el maldito Chango Dina. So maybe she felt slighted by her padrino. Any actual concrete details as to the relationship that she had with her padrino, I've been unable to attain. I'm just happy that I actually, managed to get the knowledge as to who the hell crowned her, because for the longest time, no one could tell me, or no one wanted to tell me. Continuing on. By 1978, La Lupe was divorced, dropped from her label entirely. Her career was finished. Allegedly was a drug addict. All at a time where she would have seen, we're talking about 1978, all this is happening all during a time where she would have seen billboards for Celia Cruz, for the Fania All-Stars, popping up all over New York City. And while they were having world tours and were some of the biggest artists in the world. In the 70s, you had Elton John was one of the biggest artists in the world at that time. There was Elvis Presley, the early 70s. But the Fania All-Stars, they were the biggest Latino anything of the time. And she would have seen their billboards. She would have been walking down the street and seen their billboards and all this, walking down the streets. By the 80s, La Lupe had moved from Fort Lee, New Jersey, or I'm assuming maybe even earlier than that. She would have moved from her rich area and was living on welfare in the Bronx. It actually came. It came from the horse's own mouth in a video where La Lupe is an older woman. This looks to be the early '90s, where she's preaching and talking about her financial circumstance and how people would say, "Pero La Lupe, aren't you a huge star, or at least you were? What about all the money? You used to dress so nice. You used to wear diamonds. You used to do this and that. And you lived such a luxurious life." And La Lupe said, "You said, when you buy and buy and buy, and you don't work anymore, then the shit's gonna dry up, essentially." And that's what happened to her. So La Lupe she got to experience a very luxurious life for a time. But her career died out, and you continue spending money on cars and jewelry and furs and trips. It died down. Continuing on, so by the 80s, La Lupe had moved from Fort Lee, New Jersey, and was living on welfare in the Bronx. In 1984, La Lupe injured her back as a result of trying to hang up curtains in her Bronx apartment. 1 year later, in 1985, La Lupe's apartment burned down, leaving her and her 2 children homeless, and she was a single mother at this point. Feeling betrayed and disillusioned by Santeria, she converted to Pentecostalism in 1985. She says she gave her life to Christ after she put on a benefit concert, as she threw a benefit concert to recoup the losses due to the burning of her apartment. She performed with Tito Puente that night. She had taken, and this benefit concert that I'm talking about, you can actually see this. Look it up on YouTube. It's on film. So Tito Puente was actually in attendance that night, and she had taken a lot of pain pills, and the crowd insisted that she sing. So Tito Puente and her, they put on a live show for the people. This is her testimony. A show that can still be seen on camera. I already said that. So people gave her pots and pans and leftovers of what they could to support this fallen legend, to support La Lupe. I believe one person gave keys to a new apartment for her as well. What I personally did not understand. Oh, I let me revert back. So, La Lupe said that she had taken a bunch of pills, and the people kept insisting, "Yo, sing, sing, sing." So in the middle, at the end of the performance, she saw everybody clapping for her and everything, and she claims that she heard God, or she felt God impress on her, that basically you're going to kill yourself performing for the people. So she decided to give her life to Christ. Continuing on. So what I personally do not understand, and this is aside from the point, this is my own personal thoughts now that I'm inserting in this video. What I personally don't understand is exactly why such a huge famous man like Tito Puente, who clearly after more than a decade of just put in the past, putting we're talking about the 80s, 1985, whatever beef that he had and Lupe had, they were together at the benefit concert. The beef they had, it's in the past, and he came to support her. Why he didn't just give her a portion of his own wealth, his vast wealth at that time, to help her, I don't know. Unless he never did get over the past, or vice versa. Perhaps he did extend help to her and she refused. Perhaps he did extend help to her and it was just kept quiet. We can only speculate. But Tito Puente could have certainly afforded to put La Lupe and her kids in a swanky Manhattan apartment on the strength of their success of the mid-60s. Even after La Lupe's death, Tito Puente was in attendance, and I asked myself, where were you when La Lupe was living in the ghetto in the Bronx and injured in the hospital and struggling? And even after the benefit concert, she lived out the rest of her days in the hood in the Bronx, living like a regular person, going to church and dressing nothing fancy. She was a regular person by the last years of her life. Where Tito Puente was during all this, I don't know. But in the end, it's not like Tito Puente was her keeper. He wasn't her guardian. So this is just personal thoughts that are going through my head. Maybe I'm just, a generous person, but I would think, like, yo, if I had an established relationship, like, and you're one of the people that, we had beef at some point, but it's because of you that my career elevated. It elevated more in the 70s, but you know what I'm saying? Like, I would, the dude had millions, so I don't know. And this is no hate towards Tito Puente. This is just me speculating. Yo, if he had all this money in the world, or maybe he didn't. I don't know. But I mean, he was a huge star. Let me continue on. Let me shut up. In regards to La Lupe's alleged drug use and drug abuse, it was pills, and it was safe to say, perhaps even coke, which would have been extremely prevalent, as all the stars in the 60s, 70s used it to stay awake for performances. Although her assistant claims that La Lupe was never a drug addict, but instead took uppers to wake up before a show and a downer after a show to calm down and relax. But I mean, if you're doing potentially 2 shows a day, 6 days a week, 7 days a week, and you're staying up until 2 a.m. for shows, for meet and greets and parties and world tours, then what exactly is it called if not addiction if you're taking a pill before every show and after every show? My uncle told me a story when I asked him if he ever met La Lupe. Now, my uncle, he's Ibaye, but he was a well-traveled man, and he died at like 73, 74 years old, and he remembers his time. He said that he hung out with the Fania All-Stars and whatnot. So I asked him to tell me a story if he ever met her. Let me just find it again. Okay, so my uncle told me a story when I asked him if he ever met La Lupe. Now, you have to remember that in the 60s and in the 70s, because you're probably thinking, like, what the hell? El Conquistador says his uncle was hanging out with celebrities. Yeah, you have to remember, in the 60s and 70s, celebrity was not like it is today. A lot of these people, especially the Hispanics, the Hispanics, it wasn't like being around Elvis and Marilyn Monroe and Frank Sinatra. When it came to the Puerto Ricans and the Cubans, in the 60s and 70s, a lot of these people we regard as legends, after the curtains came down, they lived like regular people. They dressed nice, but they walked Harlem. They walked the Bronx streets, and they lived like normal people that we see today. Unlike today, where a person has a whole entourage and security. I'm sure Elvis Presley had his whole entourage, and Marilyn Monroe in the 50s, huge stars. But for the Latinos, they was just, you see him in the street, hey, Hector, ¿cómo tú estás, Hector? Hector Lavoe, and Tito Puente, Johnny Pacheco. They would just walk the streets like normal people. So that's something to keep in mind. So my uncle, he said that he saw La Lupe perform for a small group. Exactly when, I don't know. But a small group, apparently. And he was he was in attendance. And he said, and I don't say this to besmirch the name of La Lupe, but I'm just telling the story. He said that La Lupe was so high that she got on top of the piano and began to take her clothes off in the middle of her singing, in the middle of her performance, and that her crew had to drag her off. If I can go back in time, I would have asked my uncle even more stories, what crazy stories, but, iba y la yento no. Samuel Santiago. Ese olochuni bukole. Continuing on, in spite of all the tragedies endured by La Lupe, by now, her grown daughter Rainbow, who I notice is tight-lipped concerning her mother's religious life, said in an interview that her mother lived the last 8 years of her life a very happy, a very funny, a very lively woman who always kept the family together. As far as I know, at least, the daughter is involved in the religion. Why do I say that? Because one person that I know apparently saw her at a tambor. So if she is, it's pretty ironic. And who knows exactly what La Lupe was doing or who she was praying to after Sunday service when she came home. She may or may have not been a closet Santeria. I don't know. The only ones who know that are her children. and anybody who was close to La Lupe. But as far as the outside world is concerned, La Lupe turned from her evil, satanic Santeria ways and became a born-again Pentecostal Christian. La Lupe died in 1962, so I have to correct myself. I said earlier in the video it was 1963. She died in 1962 at the age of 52 and is buried at St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx. You can still visit her grave today. It's very simple. Some little nuggets about La Lupe is that her biggest influence was a woman by the name of Olga Guillot, La Reina del Bolero, the queen of bolero music. And La Lupe actually began somewhat of her singing career as an Olga Guillot sing-alike impersonator of sorts, or she won an Olga Guillot radio contest. And when La Lupe actually got the chance to meet Olga Guillot in person, Olga told her to be herself. Don't try to sound like me. Cut that out. Sound like you. Who is La Lupe? So La Lupe and Olga ended up being friends for many years, but in an interview, even Olga noticed, this is an interview with Olga Guillot, because La Lupe would visit and they would cross paths every now and again. Even Olga Guillot noticed that La Lupe was behaving strangely towards the in the 70s, when her career was on a downturn. She had at some point, maybe 1974, around there, she had tried to go. La Lupe tried to do shows in Puerto Rico and try to get that audience to try and revitalize her career. She tried Broadway. It was a flop. She went to Puerto Rico. It was a flop. Trying to, I guess, play her greatest hits in the 70s, the greatest hits that she had back in 1965. She was trying to play in 1975 and whatnot, and it was just all downhill. Olga Guillot was noticing that La Lupe was behaving strangely. She was breathing frantically, seemed very anxious, jittery, as if La Lupe was on something, as if she had something in her system. Olga Guillot is someone who will definitely have her own video, because coincidentally, Olga Guillot, the queen of bolero, she too was a santera. She was maid to Obatala, to be exact. So, pretty cool. Another little nugget. This is a long-ass video. Yeah. Her engineer and producer said that no two takes with La Lupe in the music studio were ever the same. That she would actually pop the microphones with her screaming. And Tito Puente, he would complain, yo, you gotta cut it out, you know, your antics and whatnot. Like, it's cool, but we're in a studio, we gotta be more professional, and, you know, leave that stuff for the stage. In the studio, we need clean sounds, and we can't be 6 minutes into the song and we pop the microphone. Now we have to do it all over again. To which La Lupe would say, as the engineer said when he recounts his story about her, La Lupe would say, soy yo, meaning I'm me. Very interesting. It gives a little bit of insight into her character. La Lupe is remembered and regarded as a legend for her distinctive vocals, her authentic stage presence, and the songs that she sang of tragedy and loss. I forgot to mention one last detail. La Lupe's Ocha name is Ocantomi. Ocantomi. Heart of water. So, if you are a fan of La Lupe, and maybe she's an influence in your life, or you're just a fan, the next time you say you're Ibaye, mention La Lupe. Ibaye la yento no. La Lupe Ochuno canto mi. Ibaye. Hope you enjoyed this video. Peace out. Ki oloro nagbeo.